Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. We are in Parshat Vayeshev, and as we've transitioned, our goal in these classes now is to take a part of the Parsha and try to peel back beneath the surface, both explore the text and some of the commentaries, and get more of an in-depth look at the Parsha instead of a snapshot of the whole Parsha or sort of a summary, but to actually sort of leaf through the pages and try to dig in a little deeper. Um, as I shared last week, and in previous weeks, I'd really wanted to avoid starting at the beginning of the Parsha because so many people start at the beginning of the Parsha. They don't get in deeper into the Parsha. Um, I haven't been able to resist it until now, but that's what we're gonna do this week. We're gonna start in chapter 38. Um, this chapter is a sort of standalone unit, and we'll talk about it in a second. It's the story of Yehuda and Tamar, the story of Judah and his interactions, his engagement, his relationship with his daughter-in-law Tamar. I can tell you when I want to say probably third or fourth grade, we were learning Bereshit, we are learning Parshat Vayeshev. We came across this chapter, and this is one of the more what's the right word? Salacious parts of the Genesis story. And our teacher said, class, you've been so well behaved, and as a reward, we're going to skip the next chapter. And we had been sort of excited about getting to the end of the book, and so like that was unbelievable. I remember coming home, and I was very proud, and I told my parents, and my parents are like, "No, no, we're going to read it inside with you." I'm like, "No, but we behaved well. We don't need to." Um, but the truth is that this is an important chapter. It's different from the rest of the story arc, which makes it something that should give us pause. It also is the birth of Mashiach and the forerunner to King David, the Davidic line, and ultimately the Messiah. And so it's a very important chapter, not one that we should gloss over. Um, I had a friend who shared with me that in New York also the BJE, which is like the regional test, also doesn't cover this chapter. It sort of leaves it out. So it's not the we weren't alone in that. It's important to sort of frame this chapter in that what we've read so far is the Joseph story. The Parsha begins really the rest of the Torah portion, the rest of Bereshit, is all about Yosef. One of the interesting markers in Genesis in the book of Bereshit is the use of genealogy. We saw at the end of last week's Parsha both the genealogy of Esav, which sort of highlights Esav. It's almost like a credit scene. Esav is now sailed into the sunset of characters. We don't really hear of Esav anymore throughout the books of the Torah. And in some ways, we get that with Yaakov also. Yaakov transitions from bringing a frontline main character to a supporting character. And we get his genealogy at the end of last week's Parsha also. And we get the transition. Vayeshev Yaakov, this is the beginning of our Parsha. Yaakov dwells in the land of Israel, Be'eretz Migrei Aviv, Be'eretz Canaan, in the land that his ancestors dwelled in. Eile Toldot Yaakov, these are the genealogy of Yaakov. And instead of getting what we expect to be genealogy, we get the story of Yosef. Yosef becomes the primary character and really carries the story forward all the way to the end of the book. Right? Yosef dies, and that generation dies. The Jews are enslaved in Egypt, which gives rise to the book of Shemot and the Exodus and the slavery and Exodus from Egypt. And so really from now on we get the story of Yosef with one exception, which is the chapter we're going to look at today, chapter 38. And all this is the story of Yosef. Yosef. Yosef is leads to some familial disharmony with his being favored and his repetitive not stories, excuse me, dreams, and sharing those with his brothers. And ultimately, as we know, Joseph gets put in a pit, sold to slavery to Egypt. And this Parsha, this chapter picks up right in that moment. It's sort of the fulcrum of the story. The rest of the story from this point on tells you about Yosef's ultimate rise in Egypt, leading to the beginning of next week's Parsha, Vayeshev, which leads us to Miketz, the dreams that Paro has, and ultimately the attempt to get food, the whole cat and mouse story and saga with Yosef and his brothers, ultimately the reveal of Yosef, and then the bringing the Jewish family down to Egypt. All of that's the Yosef story. This is the break from that. And this is sort of the middle, the apex, the transition point in that story, which should begin to make us think about what role that plays. What happens, let's just say it quickly outside without reading all the chapter. Yehuda has a family, his three sons, Onan, and Shelah. He decides to marry off to Tamar, a local woman. For all we know, she seems to be a local woman. We don't know anything else about her. Dies because he does bad in the eyes of God, whatever that is. We're not going to get into right now. Onan, his second son, is married to Tamar in sort of a Yibum-esque marriage. Yibum is the notion that when a husband dies, someone from the family, or in our post-Sinaitic world, after the Torah has been given, it's just the brother to a wife who has not yet had any offspring from the deceased brother, marries and have Yibum. And Onan decides that we'll get into a little bit like what exactly is his concern. But also ultimately gets killed off by God. Yehuda is spooked now that Tamar is a husband killer, even though it's not really her fault, and refuses to give her to Shelah. Ultimately, Tamar takes responsibility and decides to trick Yehuda and goes and pretends to be a prostitute on the corner. Yehuda ultimately cohabits with her, and then she disappears. And in that moment, we'll talk a little bit about what that is. But several months later, Tamar, who is supposed to be chaste in her home, waiting for Shelah to get older, which is a term that Yehuda will never allow, ultimately reveals that she's pregnant. There's a whole procession that she should be killed, that she should be burnt at the stake. Ultimately, she gives Yehuda the collateral payment that she had taken from him when they had relations that ultimately led to this pregnancy, and basically leaves it in Yehuda's hands to recognize, either assert his responsibility or watch her die. And Yehuda does do that. And ultimately, this is Yehuda's sort of pinnacle, is up and up. She gives birth. She gives birth to twins. You have Peretz, and you have Zarach. And ultimately, that's where the story ends. And that ultimately becomes to be the progenitor of the Messiah. That's the summary. Let's look a little bit about this. And there are a couple questions that we want to ask ourselves. What's the role of this story? What exactly happens? There's some of the narrative details that also seem to escape us. So I want to just start with the frame. Vayhi ba'etahi. This is verse 1, chapter 38. Ba'etahi, meaning in that moment, meaning right after the story of Yosef. Vayered Yehuda me'etachav. Yehuda goes down, descends from his brothers. Either that can mean that they're living somewhere in the mountains and he comes down and he settles in the valley, which seems to be the simple explanation of the text. But you'll see the commentaries are all going to jump on this as also metaphoric, not just geographic. Vayet ad ish adulami, and he camps near the ish an Adulamite man whose name was Hiram, and ultimately he befriends Hiram, and they're buddies. What does this mean? What are we setting up? So Rashi very famously interacts. Again, just as a reminder, in this new form, it might pay to have a Chumash with Rashi um, to follow it, but if not, I will read it for you. Also, you can follow on Sefaria. I will put the link in the chat. Lama nismecha parsha zu lekan. Why? Rashi wonders, like, why are we telling this story here? What's going on? V'hifsik beparshiyato shel Yosef, and we stop the story and interrupt the story of Yosef. So Rashi gives one answer, and we're going to give a different answer as we learn this out. But Rashi says very simply, "Lilamed, to teach you shehoriduhu echav migdulato." That the brothers removed him from his point of greatness, of his position of pride against all the brothers. Meaning, Yehuda was looked upon as the venerated leader of the tribes, right? And you see that Yehuda is one of the instigators of what happens. The brothers all listen to him and they throw him in the pit. The Kishara B'tsaras Avihem, when they saw the pain of their father, Amru, they said, Atamart limchoro. You said to sell him. You said to sell him to slavery. The ilu amart lahashivo, and if you had said to return him, hayinu shomim lach, we would have listened to you. You had a position of power, Yehuda. You were the leader. You were the leader. Um, and if we would have done whatever you said. And Vayered here means he went down from with his brothers. Vayet mi'et achav. He removes his camp from his brothers. It's not just a physical decline. He didn't just move south for the winter, right? He has been removed. He has been brought down. His brothers no longer look to him as their great leader. This has been a tragic era of judgment. They trusted him to lead them and to not lead them astray. And by the way, this is like one of the most important leadership messages to talk about, right? Meaning, there are times where everyone is wrapped up in the moment. They're angry, they're out for blood, and often rightfully so. They've been embarrassed, they've been insulted, they've been whatever it is. A real leader, a real leader doesn't harness that energy and then enable people to act in their worst intentions, but is able sometimes to calm them. Meaning, part of what this is saying is, we were so angry at Yosef. We were so angry at Yosef. And you said to sell him, you could have tempered us and we would have listened to you and we wouldn't have been stuck. I don't think it's fair to blame Yehuda for everything that happened. But there's a part of this that as the leader, he could have tempered it. Um, and that's a really big component here. One of my favorite definitions of leadership, which I'm sure I've shared with one or two of you on this call, is by a guy by the name of Marty Linsky and Ron Heifetz. They wrote a book called Leadership on the Line, and they define leadership is letting your constituency down at a rate that they can absorb, meaning redirecting your constituency at a rate that they can absorb. Yehuda's brothers were furious and frustrated with Yosef. They wanted to kill him, right? Yehuda should have ultimately not harnessed their passion and say, yeah, let's sell him into slavery. Maybe he could have done something to sort of engage them at a way that would have engaged them in a different direction. And so this story, at least for Rashi, is interrupted to tell you the consequence, the fallout for the Yosef story. We're going to give another reason why it interrupts the Yosef story here. What I will argue, is that this actually tells you this is the mini story of the Yosef story, and ultimately gives you the notion of the highlights of redemption. So much so that the Midrash highlights this. The Midrash very famously says, Yaakov is mourning. The brothers are, in disarray. Yosef's in the pit. Yehuda has been removed by leadership of his brothers. What is God doing there during this moment? Anyone familiar with this Midrash? What is God doing in this moment? When everything seems to be lost, let me see if I can find the midrash. We're finding it right now, but the midrash says Yaakov is mourning. The brothers are in disarray. Yehuda's been removed. What's God doing in this moment? God is being osek. God is dealing with creating Mashiach, creating the Messiah. How do you know? From this story. What's the outcome of this story? Literally, the ancestors of Mashiach. But it's more than that. The Medrash isn't just telling you what the punchline of the story is. The Medrash is telling you is this story is the breadcrumbs for redemption for the Jewish people, and we need to pay attention to that. All right, let's go on. Um, Yehuda decides to marry off Tamar. I'm sorry, to get married. He marries to a bat ish Kanani. So there's a whole question here whether this was the right thing or not. Right? Should Yehuda have married? Um, should Yehuda have married from within the family or not? Is anyone familiar with the Book of Jubilee? Anyone of Jubilees? The Book of Jubilees is about a 50, I don't remember how many chapters it is. It's a Jewish apocrypha story, meaning it's not like not true from sorry, it's not that um uh uh it's not from the accepted texts that were what made it into the Tanakh, into the Hebrew Bible. It's other what in Hebrew we say Sefer Achitzonim, external books that didn't quite make it into the canonization, but were in the Jewish community's orbit. You have books like Baruch, or very famously Maccabees. There are four books of Maccabees. Some of them are written by very firm authors that would make sense. You have the book of Judith and Tobit and Psalm 151. You have there are lots of them. There are lots of these stories. The book of Maccabees is preserved primarily in the Ethiopian Catholic Church, and by the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews. They have the Book of Maccabees. And it's part of the pseudepigrapha of, I believe, the Catholic Church. I don't know about the Protestant and whatever. It's hard to know all the different ones. Why am I sharing all of you this? It's an interesting text, and it's definitely an old story. How do they read our Parsha? How do they read their part of this Parsha? Why does Yehuda take this? So they reads the following thing: Ki haita imo. Hold on a second. I'll just read you in the translation. What happened? What went wrong with Yehuda and Tamar's relationship? I'm sorry, not Yehuda and Tamar. And Tamar's relationship, right? We have all different other answers, but Jubilee says the following thing. He hated it because his mother was the daughter of that she was the daughter of Canaanites, meaning she wasn't whatever, and he wished to take a wife from the kinsfolk of his mother, but Yehuda would not allow um, him to do so. Sorry, the other way around. Tamar was not from the family of Canaan, and Er's mother was, and Tamar wanted to marry. I'm sorry, Er wanted to marry from the family of Canaan. right? Which is sort of the inversion of the whole story with Rivka, right? What's the whole story with Rivka? Don't marry Canaanite women. It seems that Yehuda is totally okay with marrying Canaanite women, and Yehuda's children prefer to marry Canaanite women. So sort of we see the beginning of the story an inversion of all of what we've sort of understood so far. But let's go on. They get married, they die, and Onan, verse number 8. Vayomer Yehuda leOnan, Ba'el Eshet Achicha v'yavem ota v'akim zera la'achiv. Marry your wife's, your brother's wife, and do yibum with her, and then provide an offspring for your brother, meaning keep his name alive, right? This is yibum. Vayeda Onan, kilo lo yeh hazara. Onan knew that this offspring wouldn't really be his. And so he decides not to take this marriage seriously, right? So there are two questions over here that it's interesting for us to explore. I mean, there are lots of questions, but 2 points that we're going to explore. There's a very important Ramban that talks about exactly this. What do we think this is? Yibum, right? Don't we have a mitzvah of this? This seems to predate that mitzvah. So the Ramban actually tells us this, and this is an important yesod, an important foundation when we think about the mitzvot. One of the things that we think about, we'll see another example of this in a moment. One of the things we think about when we think about mitzvot is that sometimes they're sort of pulled out of the air, right? But part of what the mitzvot are ideas, minhagim, good practices that are sanctified and captured as mitzvot for all of us to do, right? And so the Ramban says over here, Aval ha'inyan sod gadol misod haTorah b'toledot hadam. What's happening here is a sod, is an important message, a foundational idea that is being presented. V'nizkar hu le'enei roim, that was revealed even before Matan Torah, even before the Sinai experience, to the eyes of those who were looking, who could see. Asher natan lahem Hashem einayim lerot ve'oznayim lishmoa, that God gave us eyes to discern and ears to hear. Vayu hachachamim hakadmonim, that the early wise people, Kodem HaTorah, before the Torah, Yodim knew Kiyesh To'elet Dola B'Yivum Ha'ach, that there was a great reason, a purpose for Yibum, for marrying the wife of your deceased brother. V'hu ha'roi liot kodem bo, v'achrav ha'karov b'mishpacha, kiko she'ero ha'karov elav mishpachto, asher yaset nachala yagia mimenu to'elet. That there was a point for this, right? What he's referring to over here, at least according to many, is a Kabbalistic idea that when you do Yibum in these moments, it is actually some sort of reincarnation of the spirit of the brother in the child. V'lo yadanu im haya minhag kadmon lefnei Yehuda. We don't know how old this minhag, this custom, this knowledge was before Yehuda's story. Meaning we know it existed in Yehuda's time, and it seems not to be like something that Yehuda invented, although the Midrash suggests maybe he did. Maybe it existed for 1,000 years before, maybe not. Maybe it's something new. We don't know that, but we know that it's part of the story over here. The kasher ba'ata Torah, and when the Torah comes and sets up what the order of the who you can marry, who you can't, it creates the reality that one is allowed to marry under very specific purposes this wife. And he continues on. V'hinei nechshav achzariut gdola. It is a great evil, a great cruelty for be'ach asher lo chafetz liyavem, for a brother that doesn't choose to do Yibum. V'roihu shetasa mitzvah zot, and it's important for him to do this mitzvah. Now, let's just analyze a bit more. Vayeda Onan, ki lo yazara. Onan knew that the child that would born would not be his offspring. Verse number 9. What does that mean? What does that mean he didn't know that that would be his case? So the Ramban actually deals with this as well for us. The Ramban suggests, or I'm sorry, Rashi suggests that in the ancient custom of Yibum, not only is the child born supposed to be some sort of connection to the father, but they should to the deceased brother, but they actually should carry his name. Rashi says, "Haben Yikre al Shem Hamet." The brother, the son, should be called for the husband, for the deceased prior husband, for the brother. Now, is this the case? Do we know that this is what happens? We have other cases of Yibum in the Torah, and does this happen?
We don't know. The only case that we know about is with Ruth.
Right? And what are the children of Ruth's name given?
He's not named.
Is he named Machlon and Kilion?
Right.
No. So it seems to not be the case. Where does Rashi get this from? Rashi gets this from the pasuk in Dvarim that says, Yakum al Shem Achiv Hamet, that the child should get should grow up, should stand on the name of the brother who died, Velo Yemecheh Shemo MiYisrael, and his name should not be wiped out from Israel. Does that make it sound like you should name the son after the deceased brother?
No, but here we're talking about the practice at that time. So the story is implying that was the practice then.
So how come Ruth? Let's just take a detour then. How come Ruth and Boaz, after receiving the Torah, don't call their child Machlon and Kilion?
It's centuries later, so the practice has changed.
You're saying the Torah says one thing and then the practice changes?
No, I'm saying the Torah is telling us that what the practice was here, which is pre-Torah.
Right, but then the Torah tells us in Dvarim. If you flip to Devarim Chaf Hey, Deuteronomy 25, verse 6, the Torah tells us the mitzvah of Yibum, Vaya Hadbachor Asher Teled, and the firstborn that is born from that union, Yakum al Shem Achiv Hamet, should be called on the brother who died. Velo Yimeches Shemo MiYisrael, and the brother who dies' name should not be lost from Israel. So it makes it sound like you are naming them directly for their brother. But let's read on in the Ramban. The Ramban, by the way, I realize that you probably don't have the Ramban in front of you. I will share my screen so you can see it because Zoom is awesome. The Ramban says, Ein hayavam mitzuve likro livno kishem achiv hamet. The born from the Yibum union, you're not obligated to call your child based on the brother of the deceased, right? V'amar b'Boaz, right? And we give the example of Boaz. That's not the case. Vatikrena oto Oved. They call him Oved, not Velo Machlon, and not Machlon. So clearly that's not the case. So what does he say over here? What does he suggest? And then he gives another reason. V'rov b'nei Adam mitavim la'asot kein. Most people want to call their loved one, they're born based on their loved one, right? That's a big honor for people. People love to name their children after their loved ones. It's a very powerful commitment. So this is where he describes this inyan so gadol, this very deep mystical idea that many explain has to actually do with him, has to actually do with reincarnation, that really the spirit is given into the child, and that's what he's concerned about. Now let's just take a step back for a second. How would you answer for Rashi, who seems to think at least at some level, you should name the child of the born union based on the brother? How would you answer Rashi for the root story? Think about that for a second. Rashi says in Deuteronomy and Devarim, it says that you should call them Al Shem Achiv, on the name of the deceased brother. And clearly that doesn't happen in in the root story. So why not?
Achlon was not Jewish.
What? No, no. We answer for this story. This story is before Matan Torah, before receiving the Torah. Then the Torah is given, and Yibum is limited only to brothers of deceased brothers who don't have children. Meaning, if a child, if you're, or sorry, Yibum is limited to spouses of deceased brothers who were born without children, who passed without children. Right? So what is the Yibum? Why is Yibum not possible here? I'm sorry. Why is the root story different?
Well,
Why?
brother.
Exactly. Says Sam, what you see in the root story is not technically Yibum. It is something else. And this is where I just want to finish the Ramban. The Ramban says, Uba Oto, in those situations where you're not fully, it's not a yibum, it's not a brother relationship. Karu oto geula. They call it geula. They call it redemption. They call some sort of comfort and redemption for the deceased name. V'zeu inyan Boaz. And this is the story of Boaz. V'tam Naomi v'shchenot v'chein v'hamaskel yavin. He leaves it as like, and you should understand, we're not going to get into everything that he's referring to over here. But what he says over here is that there's a biblical idea of Yibum that is very narrow. A brother dies without children. The other brother has the opportunity to marry that woman and continue on the legacy of the deceased brother. But there's this general idea that predates the Torah, that predates maybe even Yehuda, called Geula, that when someone dies without children, their spouse can be married off into the family, and that captures sort of the spiritual essence of this person and ensures that they continue to exist in the world, right? That's what the Ramban teaches us, is behind part of this story. Everyone with me so far? We talked about Vayered, now we talked about this. Let's go on. What happens? Verse 11. Vayomer Yehuda leTamar. Yehuda says to Tamar, Kalato, his daughter-in-law, Shavi almana beit avich. Stay a widow in your father's house. Ad she'igdal she'ela b'ni. Until Sheila is old enough. Ki amar, he said to himself, he didn't say this out loud, he said to himself, Pen amut gamhu ke'achav, maybe he'll die like his brother. Vatelach Tamar, Vateshev beit beit aviha. He's worried that he's going to die. Tamar's the husband killer, and so she sends him home. Vayirbu hayamim, and there are many days. Vatamat bat shua eshet Yehuda. Yehuda's wife dies. No more kids are being born, and he goes to graze his sheep. Vayugad letamar lemor. One other note, I just want to note, we skipped some of the verses, but when you read the beginning of this chapter, you really read that Yehuda has sort of like forfeited everything in his family, right? Vayered me'achav, he goes down from his brothers, he gets married to a local woman, he gives birth. He doesn't even name two of his children. He's not even present for the birth of his third child. Like, it's just he's lost his mojo, right? This Yosef story has been a cataclysmic moment for him, and rightfully so. He's despondent and despair over what he has done. He's out shepherding. Vayugad leTamar lemor. It was told to Tamar, saying, "Your father-in-law is coming to shear the sheep near Timnah." And basically, Tamar decides to take matters into her own hands. Verse 14. But she takes off her veil, she covers her face. Is the debate exactly, does she cover up more, cover up less from the way she was? We don't need to get into that. And she pretends to be a harlot on the corner. Why? Ki ra'a ki gadal Sheila, that Sheila is old enough to get married. Vihilo nitna lo isha, and she's not been given to him for a wife, so she's sort of stuck. Vayura Yehuda sees her. Vayach veha lizona, and Yehuda thinks that she's a harlot. Ki kasista paneha, because she covered her face. Now, there's a little debate here, just a technical reading. What does that mean? He thought she was a harlot because she covered her face. I don't know many harlots or any at all. Thank God. Right? That's one of those quotable lines that you never thought your rabbi would say. But I imagine that they're not more covered than less covered, right? So Rashi says, what does that mean? He thought she was a harlot because she covered her face. Meaning, Yehuda didn't recognize her because when she was married and when she was his daughter-in-law, she always covered her face appropriately. And now she didn't. And so Yehuda never really seen her appropriately, right? Rashi says, Ki kishahaita bebeit chama, when she was in her father's house, haitat tzniua, she was modestly dressed. And now, when she was posing as a prostitute, she was not as modestly dressed. And that's why Yehuda didn't recognize her. It's interesting that even Ezra says the opposite. Even Ezra says that in that time, that maybe prostitutes dressed up in a certain way, and that's why he didn't recognize her. Either way, it's just interesting to read that story. Vayet ala derech, Yehuda decides to be intimate with her, and she says, "Well, how are you going to pay me? How are you going to pay me?" So he says, "I'm going to send you a gidi izim, a kid from the flock," which is clearly a very appropriate price. And she says, "Well, ma ervon, what are you going to give me to prove so that I know what collateral will you give me until I get my payment?" So he asks her, "What ervon do you want?" So she says, "Give me your chotemcha, your seal, your ptilcha, your coat, your cloak, umatacha, and your staff." Which is an odd, she's not saying, "Give me your gold watch." She asks for, and again, if we're talking about Yehuda, the Rebbe Soloveitchik brings this up a lot. We're talking about Yehuda sort of down on his life, down on his lot, having lost his status, lost his mojo, right? These are all signals of identity, of who he is. Your signet ring. First of all, important people have signet rings. Regular folk don't have signet rings. And giving your signet ring is sort of forfeiting your ID, right? Your tilcha, your cape, your cloak, right? It's not your cloak. It's sort of like the cape. Imagine like a king or royalty walking with their coat. And matecha, your staff. It's not a staff. It's a scepter, right? Ultimately, that becomes lo yatzur shevet miyudah. The scepter is the signal of the kingship. Yehuda's forfeiting all of that to this random woman on the side of the road. Yehuda's hitting rock bottom. They transact and they're intimate, and then Yehuda sends biad re'eu adulami, in the hand of his buddy, the payment, the gdiazim, verse 20, to take the Eravon back, to go reclaim these signals. And this is the part I want to highlight. Verse 21. Vayishalu et anshe Mekoma. They asked the people of the area, Lemur, where's this prostitute that hangs out on this corner? Vayomru, and they said there's no prostitute that hangs out here. We don't know what you're talking about. Vayashav el Yehuda, and he comes back to Yehuda. Vayomer lo mitzatiha. I haven't found her. V'gam anshe makom, and all the people are saying there's no prostitute that's regular there. Meaning he wants to know, like, where's the regular person? Maybe she's not there at the moment, but people should know. They're like, there's no person that inhabits that corner. Verse 23. Vayomer Yehuda, tikachla, take it. Pen lavaz, labuz. Maybe lest it become a mockery, a scoff, laughing stock. Hine shalachti gedi hazeh v'ata lo mitzata. Behold, I sent you this, and you didn't find her. And then the story goes on. In 3 months, they realize Tamar has had an affair, and they're ready to burn her. What does this mean? Pen tia lavus. Maybe this will be a scoff, a mockery about us. What mockery do you think could happen over here? What do you think?
Rashi says that the word will get out to the public about what has transpired, and Yehuda will be disgraced.
Rashi says exactly that. And I tell you, I have a lot of trouble with Rashi. What does Rashi say? Rashi says, what's going to come out? Everyone's going to know Yehuda slept with a prostitute. And it's not really appropriate to sleep with a prostitute, right? It's immoral. And therefore, let's not ask too many questions. I have 2 issues with that. Number 1, Yehuda really cares what people think about him? Clearly not so far, but that's not the best question. The best question is, what already happened in verse 23, 22, and 21? His friend doesn't quietly go and try to find this woman. He asked, on Shamakom, he asked everyone already, where's the prostitute that inhabits this corner, right? And he even says, the gam on Shamakom. Everyone says we don't know what it is, right? What can you imagine the conversation? What's his name? The Adulamite person comes to town and says, guys, my friend Judah slept with a prostitute. She has collateral. Here's the payment. Do you know where she is? Meaning everyone already knows. Everyone already knows, right? So what is Rashi suggesting? Now, obviously Rashi is suggesting something. Says the Ibn Ezra the opposite. For exactly this reason. The Ibn Ezra says it can't be that people are going to think that he slept with a prostitute and that's bad. Everyone knows. Penya lavuz, what will that be? Lilag, as a mockery. Shenatati chotem upsil umate, that I forfeited all my items of identity. Al iravon, as collateral, al davar kal kazeh, on a very minor transaction, meaning imagine if I left, collateral for my, I dropped a suit off at the cleaners, and as collateral, I took their car, right? It's so totally, my suit's fancy. It's not that fancy, right? And what happened? And now he can't get it back. He got duped by a prostitute, right? That's the embarrassment here. Not that he slept with a prostitute, right? But the fact that he got duped. They got duped and got duped bad. He gave up his passport, his signet ring, his global entry card. He gave up everything, right? That's what Ibn Ezra says. The Sforno says totally different. Again, it's interesting. We have to ask ourselves, like, is what he did appropriate or not appropriate? Rashi thinks it's not appropriate, and therefore it getting out is going to be a problem. The Ibn Ezra says it's clearly appropriate, right? Otherwise, why is his friend blabbing about it everywhere? So it must be something else. The Sforno suggests a third reason, that he'll be mocked in town for not being honest, that she'll show up one day and she'll have all of his identifying marks and say, look, this guy promised me money and he never gave it, right? So again, the Sforno is worried about honesty here. But that's not the reason why I'm bringing these up. I want to show you an interesting commentary called the Ksav Kabbalah. I'll share my screen in a second. Now, you might ask, who is the Ksav Kabbalah? So the Ksav Kabbalah is a 19th century commentary that is written by, oh, now I don't remember. It was written, it's written by Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg. And it is written from the lens of authorship in a theological battle with the Reform movement. The goal of this is to give commentary to heighten the oral tradition and the authority of the rabbis, right? That's the Zitz in Leben, the situation in which this is written. So he writes the following commentary. Pen Yelavus. V'lo chashash Yehuda al hasnut, and not because he slept with a prostitute. Ki hakadesha lo ne'asra rak mishnitna Torah, because the Torah hasn't been given yet, and before giving the Torah, you're allowed to sleep with a prostitute. Aval kodem matan Torah, before receiving the Torah, kfar kasav harambam. Maimonides writes. Haya Adam Pogea Isha Bashuk. A man could meet a woman in the street, in the market, in Ratzahu Viratzahi. If both of them wanted to be intimate together, this is a very important thing, right? The Rambam saying this in 600 years ago, that there needs to be mutual consent to have intimate relations, is something that we take for granted in our tradition, because that is the basis of any Jewish sexual ethic, right? There's absolutely no requirement, even within marriage, maritable rape is problematic in Judaism as well, right? But that's something that, like, only now in secular culture we're talking about, like consent and affirmative consent, like all of those pieces. It's one of the things I'll just highlight also in last week's Parsha, right? Last week's Parsha, we read of the rape of Dinah, right? Dinah comes back. She said she was raped, right? The story doesn't go, the birds go, well, what were you wearing? Why were you outside the tent? What were you up to, right? No, they take it very seriously, right? That's the Jewish ethic in this for 2,000 years. Anyways, I digress. For 3,000 years, I digress. Gam la'achar Matan Torah, even after Matan Torah, one's not allowed to have relationship, right, until they do kiddushin, right? This is not what Yehuda was worried about. Rak ala bizayon, only on the bizayon. What? Ki anshe mala, because righteous people of high ethical status, hayu nimnayim gad mizeh, they wouldn't sleep with prostitutes. Mitzad musar sichli, because of moral understanding. Kilo na'eh lasot payroll, because it's not appropriate to have offspring running around below lemi shelo yeh zaro myuchas achrei aviv. It shouldn't be that you impregnate all these women and you have all these descendants who don't really know who their parents are, right? It wasn't high ethical regard. It was legal, but it wasn't high ethical regard. And that's what they're worried about. What's the embarrassment? Meaning, in Yehuda's time, it was allowed to sleep with people as long as it was consensual, but it wasn't appropriate, right? It wasn't appropriate. And people who were of high esteem, like Yehuda was, it shouldn't be done. Now, what's really interesting about this is this captures a really interesting philosophical idea when we think about the mitzvot that the Torah gives us. After the Torah, no one's allowed to do this, even individual people, even regular people. What does the Torah require of us? A high moral standard, right? The Torah ultimately captures a minhag that was reserved for those of high ethical aspirations, of high ethical standards, and required it only of, in those times required only of those royal nobles. And then it required us of everyone. And it taught that we all are people of high ethical moral standing. And therefore, it makes, when the Torah takes this story and makes it halacha for everyone, it actually creates this understanding that every Jew, every man and woman, is to hold themselves to this high ethical standard, not just because that's what God wants, because we want to think of ourselves as people who are high ethical. We're all nobility. We're all priests. We're a mamlachet kohanim. And part of what is being highlighted here is that notion. All right. There's actually other commentaries to point out. For those who have the Hertz Chumash or see it in Shul, he has a fascinating commentary on this, but I don't want to get into it because I want to finish with one more idea, and then we'll close for the day. I started by ultimately what happens. They bring her out to burn. Verse 25. Vihi motzat, she's literally being brought out to the bonfire to be burned at the stake for adultery. Vihi shalcha, and she sends to Yehuda, el chamia, to her father-in-law, leish asher elelo, to these whose they are, meaning whoever's signet's ring, staff, and cloak this is, anochi hara, I am pregnant. Meaning, who's the father? The person who owns these items. Vatomer, and she says, Hakerna, recognize this. Whose are these? Judah, do you recognize who these might be? Whose passport this might be? Whose signet ring this might be? So first of all, this language Hakerna is exactly what Judah says to his father when he dunks the coat of Joseph into the blood, and says to his father, do you know whose coat this is? This bloody coat? Hakerna. Whose coat is this? And by the way, that's the same language that Yaakov uses on his father to feel him and say, which son am I? Feel my hand. Try to recognize who I am. It's all this deception, right? This is sort of the chain of deception that comes to this point that ultimately gets resolved here. What happens? Vayakir Yehuda recognizes, Vayomer, and he says, Tzadka meni, she's more righteous than me. Ki alkein lo nitatiha l'sheila beni, because I didn't give her to Sheila. Not that I impregnated her, but Yehuda recognizes the core sin here is what? He didn't give her to Sheila. He was unwilling for Sheila to take responsibility for his brothers. And this I want to end. Why is this intruding on the Yosef story? The core of the Yosef story is that Yehuda refuses to take responsibility for his brothers, right? Yehuda wants to kill Yosef because he threatens Yehuda's prized position in the family, right? Yehuda is willing to sacrifice Yosef because they don't like that he's the favorite child. And ultimately, how does Yehuda's story end? What ultimately ends this saga? When Yehuda is willing to sacrifice himself for another brother, for Binyamin. And what leads to that transition is this story. This whole story is a microcosm of that, of brothers unwilling to sacrifice for their brother. Onan doesn't want their marriage to be successful because he knows that the offspring will be credited to his brother Er. He doesn't want to sacrifice or take responsibility for his brother. Yehuda doesn't want to give Tamar to Sheila because he's worried about what would happen if Sheila takes responsibility for his brother. Maybe he'll die also. And Yehuda doesn't want to take responsibility. Ultimately, Tamar recognizes that there's this problem, and she takes initiative. She takes responsibility, even to the point that she's about to be burnt. And ultimately, Yehuda says, Tzadka mimeni. He takes responsibility. She's right. I didn't give him to Sheila. And therefore, he takes responsibility. And that ultimately is the way out of the Yosef story. And so Chazal recognize that this is inserted into this story, not just that's the breadcrumbs of Mashiach, that everything terrible is going on, and now we're going to talk about the birth of the ancestors of Mashiach. But how we get to Mashiach? We get to Mashiach when Yehuda's able to take responsibility, when brothers are able to take responsibility for themselves, for each other. And ultimately, that gives us the breadcrumbs that we follow for the Yosef story. Now, it's not just Yehuda. It's all the brothers now need to learn. And it's the whole family needs to learn. And actually, Yosef needs to learn also. He needs to learn responsibility. They all need to learn. But this story becomes the fulcrum of all of Genesis, of all of Bereshit, this whole part. And by the way, it doesn't just have to do with this story, right? It's not just the Yosef and brothers story. All of Bereshit is story of brothers not really taking responsibility for their brother. It starts with Cain and Hevel, Hashomer Achi Anochi. Am I responsible for my brother? The first rhetorical question in human history. To Shem, Ham, and Yafet, Noach's children, to Abraham and Lot, to Yitzchak and Yishmael, to Abraham, to Yaakov and Esav, all the way through the end. And by the way, it ends with not the brothers. It ends with what famous pair of brothers? Ephraim and Manasseh, who we won't get to right now, but is subjugated to the same sort of favoritism one to the other, and they don't even need to publicly take responsibility. They just live in harmony. It's like water off a duck's back. It's not even a story. And by the way, that's why we bless our children, not to be like Abraham, and not to be like Yitzchak, and not to be like Yaakov, but to be like Ephraim and Manasseh. And I'll tell you the truth, I add that in for my daughters. I know the custom is they say Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, but I want them to get along like Ephraim and Manasseh also. I want that in my family. It doesn't always happen, let me tell you. But anyways, we'll stop here. This is a little bit of insight into one of these certainly flyover stories in the Torah. I'll leave you with one last tidbit. Verse 26, where we're up to. Velo Yasaf od ledata, and he did not. What? What does your translation say?
Was not intimate with her anymore.
Right. So there's a debate. When it says lo yasaf od, does that mean he didn't continue to do what he did? Or he didn't stop doing, meaning he married her, right? He continued to be intimate with her. They got married. Does it mean that and there are a couple times, there's the voice from Sinai. Is it v'kol lo yasif, right? That it didn't stop, meaning revelation is continuing. We just have to be able to hear. O lo yasif, meaning it ended, right? There's a debate in the different commentaries over exactly what this means. But we'll stop here. And we'll pick up next week. I think we'll probably not meet. I think, are people busy on the 25th? I'm happy to meet.
Yeah, I'll be away.